project of knowledge we call science.
Oh, give the man a bloody medal! You're all this little boy!
For good or bad, science and technology affect us all. Through them we control our health, our environment, even our heredity. So tonight we're asking the big question. Who controls science? Who can we trust with our future?
We can make a harbor where a harbor is needed. For the cost that we used to pay merely to equip an already existing harbor. We can make a water level canal for a fraction of the cost that we used to pay for the more clumsy, less serviceable lock canal. We can do that by the simple means of detonating nuclear explosions underground. We can remove thick layers of earth, 500 feet, 1,000 feet.
So that was a clip of Edward Teller talking to
Alan Wicker.
Alan Wicker,
Yes,
that's right, thank
Alan
you,
Wicker.
him promoting something that we know has ominous side effects to the public as doing something totally useful, using a nuclear explosion to make a canal. And the public was fed that line of argument about the nuclear industry, that it would be benign and it would provide cheap power, when in fact, of course, it's gone on television since that time, that it was about the arms race and building bombs and making,
But was it just the government that fed that line? I mean, here we have a scientist who's clearly a clearly indication of a mad lunatic person, expressing opinions which are totally mad. I mean, but that's very common.
There's a more important point in this particular clip, which is it's a long tradition of arguing that weapons of war have a beneficial civil side. And essentially what Teller's doing, I think Leslie's absolutely right here, what he's saying is don't just think of the bomb as a weapon of mass destruction. Think of it as something that will build you better harbours and better canals.
Yes.
And the
that
nuclear
story
power
goes on
industry
and on.
is still being sold as Britain's energy future, while coal seams are closing. I mean, it's ridiculous.
We
while
really
children
should
get
see
leukemia all around the areas where there are nuclear
Maybe
power
we should
stations.
see the clip of the Queen
Yes,
early
yes,
on. I think this is a...
I've got it just here.
It will be shown.
I've got, it's on here.
Yeah.
Today, as power from Calder Hall begins to flow into the national grid, it may well prove to have been among the greatest of our contributions to human welfare that we led the way in demonstrating the peaceful uses of this new source of power. It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
The world's first industrial atomic power station is at work. In full operation, it will supply electricity for the domestic needs of a city of 1 million people. A new era has dawned.
I was actually looking for another clip, or perhaps another version of this clip, but it contained that famous line that nuclear power will provide electricity too cheap to meter. And I wanted to use that as an illustration of how this technology was in fact oversold. I think sold in language that any layperson can understand. And I think that notion of having promised a lot in the past...
Do you think the scientist promised that?
I
think... Do you think it was a scientist who... I can't imagine a scientist saying the cost of electricity will be too low.
Another of my kind of problems is the notion that the scientists do in fact live or work in a vacuum in our society. In fact, they are so closely intertwined with the industrial applications of what they do for the most part that I prefer to view them as a single entity. I mean, I think there is an unholy trinity of the government, industry, and science that actually do account, for the most part, for the direction and control of science. So while I agree there may be an individual scientist who would have been appalled by that, in general, the dialogue has been one of over-promising, under-delivering, and always having failed to note that there was going to be a downside.
Scientists certainly have a motive in projecting the potential value of what they do in order to continue doing their work, which is what they love. So there is a temptation amongst scientists to exploit, and I think this is absolutely true, to exploit political and public ignorance of science by promising far too much. It's a temptation that we all suffer from.
Because they're pushed to do it.
Well, it's partly they're pushed to do it, it's partly they see it as an easy way of getting funding for their research. And we have to step beyond that in sophistication and say that in the end science will be better off. In the end science will be trusted more if it's more honest.
But I don't think we could see a member of the royal family or anybody else opening a major new technical installation with quite the heroics that surrounded Calder Hall in '56 anymore, because people would actually laugh. And why would they laugh? They'd laugh because we live, you might say, in a more cynical age, but we live perhaps in a more experienced age where we've come to recognise that new technologies are important, but there are no neat, easy, free solutions either. And surely the problem about the 50s and 60s, perhaps the beginning of the 60s, was that there was a sense abroad that science and technology were a straightforward, essentially cheap or even free solution to all sorts of problems.
Lunches.
We no longer believe in free lunches,
Well,
and we know that we have to resolve lots of problems, and it won't be straightforward.
But actually that's simply not true. If you go to France today, you get President Mitterrand opening these TGVs, and you get him opening the Channel Tunnel.
TGV?
Train de grande vitesse, it's French.
Okay, right, yeah.
But he is French and he can be forgiven
yes,
for speaking
we'll
in
allow
French.
him to speak French.
And when he opens the Channel Tunnel, the whole of France goes on a tremendous patriotic technological wave. There are many cultures still absolutely imbued with the culture of technological progress as a good thing. What in fact you're all talking about, in my opinion, is just the wrong thing, and it's as simple as this. With the selling of nuclear power and all the rest of it, we're not actually talking about development of a technology that was undertaken because people thought it would give economic benefit, because if it were, it would have been done by the private sector. This has throughout been an abortion of government-inspired technology for primarily military reasons. And having done that, and legitimately, I think, they tried to find a technological spin-off, an economic spin-off, and they, the politicians, oversold it. You can go back to 1776 with Adam Smith, and Adam Smith quite clearly lays out that the moment politicians get their paws on almost anything, they will adulterate it and corrupt it, and they will never make an economic penny on it, because it's taxpayers' money and they're not interested in profit. I now want to quote another clip.
Then we'll have a clip, and then we're very soon going to break coffee.
Okay.
Well, we can hear it, but we can't see it.
All right, you can't see it because there's nothing to see, it's up in space. Now, the important thing is this. In 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik, and this galvanized and terrified the Western world. It became absolute dogma that Russia was going to be the economic superforce of the latter part of the 20th century. And I now quote two of the most important political leaders of the time. Here comes one. Listen to this most important clip. 1963 in Scarborough.
We mean business about world development. We're going to establish a full-scale Ministry of Overseas Development with a Minister of Cabinet rank to join with the Ministry of Science in mobilizing Britain's scientific wealth for the task of creating not the means of human destruction, but the munitions of peace. The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Yes, that is the point.
But I want to talk about this because this is one of the most interesting economic experiments of the 20th century, and it is remarkable how little attention it has received. Because although Harold Wilson has received a reputation as being devious, he actually did this. He fully implemented Robbins. He doubled the number of British universities in only 7 years. He tripled the amount of government funding for basic science in this country. He really believed in the Soviet Baconian model, Government funding of science gives us economic growth. And where did that experiment ended up? That experiment ended up in 1977 with Dennis Healey, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, being summoned from Heathrow Airport by the International Monetary Fund to go back to 11 Downing Street because the IMF was now going to run this country on monetarist lines. It's an experiment that has failed.
But you're not suggesting that the government expenditure on science crippled the budget. I mean, we're talking about an expenditure now of about £1 billion a year. That's the OST budget for civil expenditure. 2 million altogether if you include Department of Trade and Industry and so on. Compared with an annual budget for the government of 250 billion or something like that, it's less than 0.5% of government expenditure. The total expenditure on science in this country is about 10 billion. So it's a relatively small fraction of really, in total government expenditure terms, a relatively small amount of money.
But I think there's one very important historical lesson to be learned from the 60s, which Terence indeed has alluded to, and that is that the British industry and indeed British government in both the civil sector and the military sector were spending more on research and development than the industry, the government of any capitalist country other than the United States. Despite that very high expenditure, the rate of growth of the British economy was not as high as that of Germany, Japan or France. Indeed, Germany, Japan and France took over from Britain in terms of wealth per head in the 1960s and 1970s, despite spending less on R&D. And that is a very important lesson.
You can only count on the private sector to come up with the right answer about which technologies are really needed to satisfy its customers' needs in certain market situations, and only where products are actually the answers to people's problems. And as long as you rely on the private sector, you're only going to get one kind of answer. And my example would be agriculture. In agriculture, right now, you could solve, let's say, the problem of pests eating and reducing yields of crops in two ways. You can either adjust the system to rotate crops so that pest cycles are broken and they never get to economically important levels, a systems-based solution which solves your problem, or else you can come up with pesticides, either chemical or biological or biotechnological pesticides, a completely different kind of solution. As long as you rely on the private sector driven by companies, you will only get the second solution, a bunch of pesticides. And a bunch of pesticides can be argued to be not a very good way of creating a sustainable agriculture.
Because there's a historical inaccuracy here. The agricultural revolution was a British gift to the world. It was entirely without a single penny of public funding. The discovery of crop rotation was a group of rich Norfolk farmers. It wasn't publicly funded, it wasn't detergents, all the rest of it. The whole business of agricultural revolution was privately funded.
It wasn't discovered any time recently. No. If you think it was,
You think human nature changes?
I think crop rotation has been relied on by cultures for a long time because of its advantages.
Well,
and I really can't speak to the British system.
Us that potatoes and wheat was also a British invention. If you allow systems method of agriculture, then you are actually giving control to the farmer himself or herself or the family. But if you bring in pesticides, then you take the control from the farmer and give it to the whoever is manufacturing the pesticide. Similarly, if you rely on nuclear technology, then you're taking control from the people of the third world to whoever is developing the nuclear technology. On the other hand, if you use other sources of energy like solar energy or biogas or whatever, then you're actually providing them with an opportunity to maybe control their own sources of energy. The basic issue in science, to my way of thinking, is the issue of control. That's what really science is all about.
One of the basic principles of controlling any activity in our society is you want to have a separation of powers. The American Constitution is based on this principle. If you have science performed by government, you have very little separation of powers. You have a government vested interest in abuse of it. If you have science performed by independent companies, charities and universities, with government stepping aside, you have the capacity for government as the most powerful player in society of intervening on behalf of weak members of society.
Faraday built the first electric motor and experimented with electricity and magnetism. He showed they were aspects of the same force.
a Prime Minister of this country, it was Mrs. Thatcher who said it, acknowledged that the economic benefits of Michael Faraday's research was greater than the capitalisation of the whole of the stock exchange. Her words, not mine.
The difficulty for policymakers in assessing fundamental research is that it may take decades, even centuries, to pay off in industrial terms.
You see, what we're after is new understanding. And we're talking about the most profound and basic research, but new understanding about nature.
But the whole point of understanding is it does become applicable, surely.
Oh, yes, but we never address that question.
In a vacuum.
Yes,
but I think that is the only point to take. I mean, one of the reasons, the only position to hold for the scientists, if we're talking about knowledge, because I'll give you an example. One of the first applications of Faradism, which most people now know nothing about, was an enormous industry called electrogynecology, which was so horrible.
It was awful. They were shoving things into
women.
They
were putting electrodes inside women and electrodes on their abdomens and sending charges through the tissue in some belief that it would do the women some good. I regret to say that many women swung their legs over the side of the couch after this abominable proceeding and thanked the doctor and said they felt very much better. And the doctor wrote down, how odd, it's not supposed to work for 3 or 4 days. Faraday would have been probably most embarrassed to have discovered
But does that mean that Faraday shouldn't have done his work then?
Absolutely not. He was not responsible for the fact that there are a whole lot of people out there who are just looking for something, anything. I may also say that one of the first applications of radium was to shove it inside vaginas.
Efforts to control science, with a few notable exceptions like Mrs. Thatcher's intervention about the survey on sexual habits, efforts to impede the progress of science have been notably poor in success. And
well, equally, hers was poor because somebody else stepped in.
Because someone else stepped in, and if it hadn't been done here, it would have been done as it has elsewhere. Government efforts from Rothschild report onwards to promote particular areas of research, the huge investment in cancer research in the 60s and now in AIDS research are singularly unproductive. The really successful productive applications of science are those that grow spontaneously.
My point isn't that pure science isn't important. My point is that pure science is vitally important and would be better funded if people were not taxed, so that the philanthropists and the private donors of science, as happened in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, could be re-empowered.
You can't leave it up to industry. Industry only cares about making money.
I think we're living through a period of very uneasy, uncertain negotiation about how we would manage this tremendously powerful resource that we've managed to generate over these centuries. And though the issues of how you manage it apply whether it's being funded publicly or privately, because it'll still be there, it'll still be powerful. And it seems to me that, you know, we've got to put them all in the same bag here. From the point of view of most of us, these things are just big entities that have a big influence on us, and we'd like to have some say, please, in what they do and how they do it.
That brings me very nicely to something that, an issue of the moment, the nuclear issue is an old one, technology is a sense is an old one. Genetic engineering, genetic manipulation. Watson and Crick, I think, were doing blue sky research, were they not, when they were looking for the double helix, and they found it. What that has led to is amazing.
Fine,
but there is a clip here that says
yes.
a lot about this,
Yes.
and I think we just hit the button now, don't we?
What sort of characteristics were you thinking of?
Well, we definitely don't want to tamper with the physical side of things in any way.
We would like her to have my father's red hair. Ah. Oh, well, that's easy. We can make her homozygous on the 3 hair colour genes. What about her character and emotion?
Listen to this.
Well, yes, there are a few things we'd like to have modified if possible. We'd like to reduce shyness and susceptibility to depression without necessarily damaging any artistic potential. Also, we'd like it to be musical. And if possible, also we want her to be ambitious.
Of course, we want her to be as healthy as possible.
Well, the only problem seems to be with ambition. The GMAP committee are currently re-evaluating the societal impact of the Bibbs-Murdoch configuration, and it has been temporarily withdrawn. But there should be no problem with the other changes.
Well, I think we can live with that.
Live with that. That was Brave New Babies, and it went out a dozen years ago on Horizon. And what it was suggesting then was that the time would come when you lot, the scientists, those of you who are you in particular perhaps,
They're going to fight back soon there.
Would be able, well, anyway, the scientists would be able to twiddle with our genes and produce perfect babies. The downside of that, of course, is that there are such things as imperfect humans who can be discarded, like the zygote. I mean, gives you the horrors. Only a dozen years later, we are actually finding, we've found it for cystic fibrosis. Nobody would object to trying to prevent a baby from having cystic fibrosis, even if the only way we can do it is by not talking about the inevitable abortions that are part of it. Where do we go from here? And that's what's frightening the public. And that is why there is, at the moment, I think, an immense flight from science. This is why the herbalists, the alternate medical men, the fringe people are making a fortune because they don't trust the doctors and the scientists anymore, because that is the way they think the world is going.
This isn't, in one very important way, this kind of story is not at all new. It's the element that's new is the genetic engineering bit. One could have that kind of story being told in, let us say, 1900, around the eugenics movement. How do you breed people? And of course we've told these kinds of stories about animals for centuries.
Yes, right.
The whole notion of pedigree in animals, breeding and selection in animals. What we find horrifying is the extension to people, and that the possibility of that extension to people has been part of our culture for a very long time. So I think we shouldn't be too scared by by the newness of the story.
But there's an important thing to remember here, which is the client population. Now, one of the interesting things about the extra knowledge that we have, we now know that we can tell the sex of a fetus very early in pregnancy. People are making up their own minds whether they wish to share the information and what the information actually means to them. People are doing their best to understand a medical technology which is enormously complex. For most people in our society, the most important engagement with science in their lives is going to be with medical science, and it becomes overwhelming in the last years of their lives in particular. And they know about all kinds of things they didn't know about before. They discuss all kinds of procedures they wouldn't have been able to pronounce the names of before. I actually think that the client population is doing pretty well faced with this extraordinary explosion of available information, and they're actually making their own kind of sense of it.
How on earth are you going to persuade ordinary people, which was your phrase earlier, the rest of us, the non-scientists, the untrained people, to take their share of this decision-making if, in a sense, you speak a private language, which you still do?
Well, I don't believe that we do. I don't agree that that's such a big problem.
I'm listening from this side.
Well, I think we're all speaking and understanding each other here perfectly well, if I may say so. I think the real problems are not to do, even with the gap in comprehension that was referred to earlier. There is a gap in understanding. Many people are ignorant of many things. In fact, everybody's ignorant of most things, and we need to be aware of that. But I think also there's a lot of evidence to show that when people are given the opportunity and the motive, they're perfectly capable. Most normal people, and that includes most of us, are capable of understanding what they need to understand to make a decision in life. And I don't think we should be pessimists about the relationship between science and the rest of society.
It is so scary to know what we don't know.
But you do know. You know more than enough to make a judgment as a citizen about most of the technologies that have been portrayed.
I'm told about it, Margaret. My problem is I don't know, and nor do many people like me know what to come and ask you. We rely on you totally and wholly to come and tell us what you're doing so that then we can ask the questions.
That really is not the case.
I think we've had 100 years of experience. We've had 100 years or more of experience of these things. I think the striking thing is how little our language has changed. And I think in our everyday experience we can deal with these things much more easily, much more straightforwardly, perhaps on an ethical committee. In dealing with a concrete case, we find ways of doing this.
So
the problem is that we can't...
I have a clip I want to show. Can I suggest a clip which I think talks to this question immediately of the language we can or can't use, because I think the scientific community across the industrialised world has increasingly been challenged in language not of its own to give good account of itself, and so there's a forced change in the way scientists speak today. Let's have a look at this.
The debate has spilled onto the streets. Some scientists seek a dialogue with the people.
Science Physical magazine. It's all about the politics of science.
And in return, others find themselves put on the spot.
Now, you made the statement there's no known dangerous organism has ever been produced by a recombinant DNA experiment. Yes. Now, just what the hell do you think you're going to do if you do produce one?
The scientist's embarrassment is recorded for all the local TV stations. This is Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Mayor Vellucci raised the first local protest.
And it's a vote. Councillor Russell now wants to strike out 30 days.
Recent revelations that the Defense Department secretly conducted experiments by spreading bacteria in our subways to learn more about the impact of such an act serves as an excellent example that there are, or at least should be, limits to the pursuit of knowledge. The concept of scientists developing their own guidelines to do their own work under bothers me. I raised the issue with the representative from NIH whether or not she believed in civilian control of the military. And to me, that's the point. We don't want generals running the military any more than we want the automobile industry establishing pollution control standards or safety standards. And I don't think we want the scientists designing their own rules of the game.
This was a debate going on in the mid-70s, in fact, when, interestingly, the scientific community itself had actually blown the whistle and said there may be a safety problem with new genetic techniques. And what many of them seem to have been surprised at, which I think in retrospect was naive, was that when they were asked, as you heard, questions to which some scientists on the spot were reduced to complete incoherence. I mean, the scientist in that clip was unable to answer the question, what are you going to do if you find one of these bugs that is dangerous? And it seems to me that this is a sign that the dialogue between science and the community is changing, and it's changing in ways that the community is dictating, not the scientists.
Right, then what is the system? I mean, let's get down to some nitty-gritties, which is if the dialogue is essential between science and technology, maybe on the one hand, and somehow the public, the customer, the democracy on the other hand, then what are the committees, the mechanisms, the agencies, John, by which we actually establish these interfaces?
Well, there is no single answer. You have to, lots of different things have to happen. But for example, one thing that's being experimented with this year in Britain for the first time is an initiative started in Denmark, where you would turn the whole dialogue around, and instead of the usual way, which tends to happen, which is that people who know say what they think the people who don't know ought to know, it's been turned around so that you start with an area such as biotechnology and say, let's appoint a panel of so-called lay people who know nothing about this but are interested, and let's let them ask the questions they want to ask. Let's let them drive the agenda and let them write a report on what they think about this when they've answered everything they needed to answer and been told everything they needed to know. It's called a consensus conference. We've never done it before in this country. We're going to try it. It's the kind of thing we need to do. Sorry, maybe we have done it.
Sorry, there has been a consensus conference on something very small. You might not think it sufficiently important. It was in Merseyside, and it was on the treatment women want in midwifery. It may not sound a very important subject, but it was a consensus conference because I chaired it.
Right.
I was there. Well, there were a row of people there who were the people who were coming up with the consensus, and it was absolutely fascinating. It was the first I'd had anything to do with. And that sort of thing is marvellous. But all of this, we're doing it ourselves.
No. Please, Chairman, let's change the subject to music. Let's just for a second, just one example. Now, let's say if people only understood music by listening to the most avant-garde composers playing the very latest music, what interest do you think people would have in music? Almost none at all. But that's the way science is processed. We only learn about the very latest advances in science. And now, we see, if only the media, the press, the televisions would concentrate, say, on a young person giving an address on thermodynamics, which is as old as the hills, like a Mozart symphony, and giving an address on a basic understanding. You see, you're trying to understand...
Donald, that's a bit utopian, though, I have to say.
Well, I want to see utopia.
But the fact is, you see, that the society that we live in does have to decide about the latest, the newest, the fastest,
You've got to do it in a vacuum. You've got to have a basic understanding.
But you can provide that to the people when they see why they need to know. People need to have a motive for learning. There's so much to learn. You can't expect everybody to take it.
Make it exciting, and that's the thing.
Look, sitting here, I've learned a lot from you lot. All of you.
It is exciting.
I'm taking all sorts of information away with me that I didn't have when I got here. And this is the point of the sort of loose setup I would like to see at consensus conferences, if you like, but all over the country, everywhere, all over the world for that matter. Groups of lay people, people talking.
Else.
Just learning.
At least in the States, there are emerging mechanisms to actually plug the public into this basic question of what kind of science are we going to do. And frankly, it took me a long time to find out where they were, but as I said, I work in the area of biotechnology and agriculture. And I finally found, by working through the system that actually somebody, someplace, organizes what they call, oddly enough, customer conferences to ask people, the customers of agriculture, what kind of research they want. In the past, all the customers have been the soybean producers, the beef producers, the corn producers. Those of us who either ate the food or who drank the water that was polluted by the chemicals that they used in making the food were never considered customers before. We fought to enlarge that decision-making process so that they now admit, folks, and I actually am a representative, I go in with other people who drink the water, and they want is to tell the scientists that from now on we don't want more chemical pesticides, we want fewer.
The British government in 1993, last year, published a major white paper setting out the ways in which it was going to run its policy essentially for academic research to the Office of Science and Technology. It is a foresight exercise, so-called, between industrialists, between academic scientists, and between government departments. And even when that white paper was being discussed, there was hardly any discussion in this country about the need to bring the public in. And I think it's a case where the United States is well ahead of Britain on this.
Because we are bedeviled by secrecy. The Medicines Act enshrines secrecy, what you mustn't tell the consumer.
It's partly that. It's
this is one of our major problems.
Science policy as in the same way as we think of health policy. We think about it in these terribly abstract ways, in these moralistic ways, in relation to science and all the rest of it. It's something. Decisions are being made about the kind of science that's going to be funded every minute of the day.
Every day, and we think that they're not our decisions.
But I think this is a bit black and white. I mean, I agree with all of this in a way, but I think David's painting an overly black and white picture in a sense. I mean, yes, the traditional methods of policy making in this country have been, especially in the area of science and technology, have been fairly immune from the public. But I see the system beginning to become just a bit more porous. I mean, it is one of the institutions of science funding, one of our research councils, which has agreed to fund a consensus conference this year on plant biotechnology, a major strategic area. They want to know, because they fund research in this area, what the public concerns and interests in this area might be. Now, that's the sort of thing which seems to me to suggest that there might be a growing recognition of the need to get constructive dialogue between science and the wider community going. It's a small issue in itself, but I think we've got to open up those areas for the long-term benefit of science and society, because in some senses they stand or fall together, it seems to me.
I think what we've got to assume, Claire, is that scientists are not going to open up. It's the public that has to go out and drag the scientists out and open them up.
The more you try, the harder it is. Because I must come back to this central point. We don't know what we don't know.
Yes.
Do you find
this is our awful dilemma.
Claire, everything you say seems to imply that you find scientists almost uniformly unwilling to talk to you.
This has been my experience.
I hate to say it because it sounds awful. It sounds like yesterday to me. This really does. I mean, these days,
I'm talking about
medical research institutions have big press offices. They're out there hunting stories. It's exactly the opposite of what you described. They desperately want
coverage. They're not there to tell the truth. They're there to control it. No, that's not about real questions. Now, can I be patronising? You are now falling for the jargon of the press officers. They're putting out the story they want, not what we want to know.
And that's why the biotechnology industry is encountering so much problem.
This is my point.
Actually, Claire, can I just say something here?
Tell us.
Claire, let me tell you.
Something difficult, or
Claire, I will tell you.
I want to know what you're doing.
Claire, I will tell you.
This is. I can't wait that long. I want to know now.
A clip from David. Yes.
Raymond Baxter lied. All those tomorrow's worlds were talking rubbish. Things didn't get better. We don't all have little robots that do the housework and wash the car and suck the fluff out of your belly button. No, it never happens. Imagine if tomorrow's world had really known the truth back then. 20 years from now, in the 1990s, the way people live their lives will have changed radically. Conventional housing, for instance, will be disappearing. Instead, scientists will have developed these. The idea is very simple. You simply tear up the box, put it in a doorway, and instantly you have a bed, a home, or a toilet.
The advances science will make are boundless and enormously exciting. In the 1990s, people will be enormously excited by these. It's called a widget, and it's a brilliant brilliant way of persuading people to buy crap beer.
So when the swings and roundabouts finally come to a halt, how do we actually get the consensus working? Let's say, how successful are these attempts to bring scientists, the policymakers, the public, the consumers together, John? Have we got something that we can really build upon here?
Well, I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, the Danes have been trying these things for 7 or 8 years. They've had a dozen or so of these conferences. They seem to have found it helpful. And I think we need to be, frankly, in the spirit of science, experimental here. I don't think we know yet how to conduct a proper dialogue between people who have lots of expert knowledge and most of the community that don't, when what the people know matters to everybody else. I don't think we know how to do that. I mean, maybe humanity hasn't had long enough at this yet to work this out.
I'd like to give an example of one that I tried that would interest Germaine Greer. It's in the area of birth control. What would be the most acceptable way for you to do it? In some country where it's very important to have a son as the first child, they might say, if you can take a pill that would predetermine the first child will be a boy, it'll have an impact. Or in another place, they'll say X, Y, Z. First, come up with that wishing list and see what that wishing list is from the soft side rather than from their hard side, from the scientific one. You might actually find out you could establish a set of priorities, scientific priorities, which would respond to a perceived social need, but a perceived social need that is a different one in different cultures.
So
I presented that to the Swedish Academy of Sciences. I thought that it would be a fascinating experiment. And you know, every 10 years I repeat a suggestion. And one of these days, I think I'm as much an optimist as you, maybe in 50 years people actually proceed that way. Now, I picked only birth control because I'm looking at Germaine Greer, but it makes no difference. I could look at you and say, let us do it in some other major area, but I want to do it different from what you people have tried to do. You tried to say we make a scientific discovery and then immediately know what all the various social implications could be, which we can't. I'd like to reverse it in a way and ask first for the social needs, the societal needs, not social needs, and then see whether they're
Sorry, Claire, let Germaine. Yeah.
Actually, I was smiling broadly when you said that because I seem to remember a long time ago there was this suggestion that the best way of motivating people to use contraception would be to ally the contraceptive agent with an aphrodisiac. And the example of Sweden strikes me as enormously appropriate. That if you actually did argue that, if you actually did say, let us marry the contraceptive pill to an aphrodisiac, we would suddenly realize what the hidden agenda is, because people would get terribly nervous. We don't actually want people to take a pill that makes them do it more. That was one of the big arguments about the contraceptive pill in the first place. There is a hidden agenda, but I think to expect the scientists to respond to sort of user-led demand is to ignore the serendipitousness of it and the paths that it takes.
But scientists do that. They do that. If you look at industrial research, if you look at military research, that's what they do. If you have military research, you have the officers from the armed services coming up with a wish list, and the scientists are asked to respond to it. If you look at industry, then you have market research.
They're not doing basic research.
They will be doing
But
some
this
basic
would not
research,
guide
but
basic research.
and it wouldn't apply to basic. Presumably, for basic research, you want to anticipate future needs, not
you don't anticipate anything. You see, we're dealing with again.
Needs.
We keep on pretending that science is a commodity. Science is about understanding the universe. We live in.
We're not pretending that science is a commodity.
But you're acting as if it is.
What we're saying is there are many definitions of science. There are many definitions of science, and science is done for many purposes in this world. The particular point I'm making is that it is not unusual and
You're
has
saying
not
it again.
been for
Science
decades.
is done. The way your word construction.
I think what we need is maybe a new kind of professional who can bridge the two sides together. Well, maybe a professional critique of science. I mean, we have professional culture critics.
It's beautiful, Francis.